All right, welcome everybody. My name is Matt Bezick, and I am the Technology and Communications Chair for NAEOP. And this is a ongoing professional development series that we do every month, just covering a variety of topics. Today, we are covering how to digitize your files. And I'm actually excited Victoria's got her camera on because this is one of the things she's been asking for a while. And we were kind of poking around and digging, and like a lot of us have gone to priority trainings or heard from a lot of the Trio experts about kind of best practices about file management and recording, and like what are you doing to kind of make sure you're in compliance with when it comes to record keeping. But we are in like a modern era, right? So a shout out to all these wonderful folks on those Trio training circuits, but like the old days of like a locked door to a locked cabinet where there's another lock hidden inside the cabinet and you have to solve like a puzzle and a Sudoku to then get access to your student files. Like those are just becoming less relevant in a world that is immensely electronic. And now with many of our student applications going electronic, there's kind of this need to figure out like, how can we do a better job of modernizing our filing system? And what we found is there's not like somebody that's doing it the best possible. It's still kind of like a new frontier. So what today is meant to be is really just a conversation around what elements, because what I'm finding is there's a lot of elements programs are doing that are successful from the various aspects of what we're required to do in Trio programs to stay in compliance. But I don't know that there's any one program or one director who has this mastered and is 100% on board. So today is meant to be a very fluid kind of conversation around what those best practices look like. And I kind of want to start it. I've been, so here in Oregon, I am the executive director of our like state association, and we've been helping some of our programs rewrite and develop some policy and procedure manuals. So as a result of that, I got to go back through and like read all the legs, all the regs, all the EDGARs, all our cost principles, like every single thing. And I knew we were going to be doing this. So I very intentionally was looking for like, what language is out there that specifically relates to this topic? And of all the hundreds of pages, I basically found a singular item, right? So we honestly, there's not a ton to go off of. However, these are in our cost principles. If you are somewhat familiar with these things, we're talking 200.336, but more or less the methods for collection, transmission, and storage of information. So the federal awarding agencies and the non-federal entity should, whenever practicable, collect, transmit, and store federal award-related information in formats, in open and machine-readable formats rather than closed, or on paper in accordance with the applicable legislative requirements. And then when you go down here, it specifically states that when original records are electronic and cannot be altered, there is no need to create and retain paper copies. When original records are paper, electronic versions may be substituted through the use of duplication or other forms of electronic media, provided they're subject to periodic quality control reviews, provide reasonable safeguards against alteration, and remain readable. Really what this comes down to is they literally have it in here that says like, hey, do this electronically. Like you don't need to have paper files for all your students, all your applications. Now that feels contradictory if this has been in there that whole time when like we were required to have paper signatures and wet signatures for contacts and on applications. But really there's not a ton. They speak a reasonable amount about what needs to be in student files, like what are the things you actually need to document and track. But in terms of like specifically digitizing it and what does that look like, there's not much more beyond that. So really it ultimately comes down to who has access to those files. And that's the thing that it's kind of hard to translate across everybody, because some campuses are Google, some are Microsoft, some want you to use their like internal drives, right? Some people have a G drive, a T drive, an R drive. It's different letters for every single one that in theory limits some access. And this is a secure place within your institution's databases where information can be kept. So a lot of the conversation comes down to like, what is it within your institution, the grant holder? What are you capable of doing? And how can you limit access? Because at the end of the day, I think most people are still using physical files for every single one of the students you serve, and you kind of have an understanding of what contents need to be kept in there. If there's questions about that, we can get to that in a minute. But I just want to kind of highlight that, those files need to be kept in cabinets that are locked and have very limited access in terms of who can get in there. And you have to do periodic checks to make sure that you can't be altering those documents. So if we're going to go to a digital version of this, whether you're using Microsoft Teams and SharePoint, whether you're using Google Drives, like they're not dramatically different in that it's just a virtual folder that exists. You can put all that information in, but you do have to be mindful of who has access to that information and how alterable is that stuff. Obviously, like an electronic signature kind of needs that timestamp and that date. Like we can use things like DocuSign or Adobe. People can sign electronically, but oftentimes you kind of need those certified signature copies that are an unalterable signature version of things if we were really going to get like really stingy about, altering some of these documents. So I almost kind of just want to stop there and just make this kind of an open conversation, or like lead in with some questions in the chat to kind of be like, where do people either have questions as it relates to how do I kind of create a more electronic version of my filing and storage system, or any best practices, right? Like what are the elements or the things that you are maybe doing in your program where you've started to digitize elements of it and just kind of present those so other folks can kind of maybe get an idea of how to implement that as well. So there's already one question in there about does anyone use Blumen or even student access, right? Do we use our database system to scan documents into the student profiles? And this is a good question, right? Because most of your services, if you're using a database, most of the documentation for APR purposes is all kept within that database. So I think that is a good question. Like, do people scan in the actual application or a needs assessment into the student profile? So that becomes the central hub for all their information.
I can say we do not currently. We've actually been going kind of the other direction and putting it in our Google Drive, because so much of what we do now is through DocuSign. And so we already have like these PDFs and stuff. And so we've been doing all of our like intake application management basically through Google instead of through student access, just because it just seems a little more accessible and you can interact with it a little bit more. But I see the point for having everything be like uploaded to the student record in student access or in Blumen. I can see how that would be super valuable to have it all in the same place.
I think I can comment. I've heard that, like, if you want to upload a transcript, right? Let's say you're a pre-college program and you want to upload the transcripts, which we need to keep on file. You can input transcript information, but I don't believe you can just like attach a PDF to a student's file within Blumen. That might be part of some of the limitations, which is why using a shared drive or Office 365, right, can be better. Because what you're speaking to, Victoria, like you can use DocuSign for the application. You can, yeah. Oh, great. We have plenty of. Anybody else have any thoughts? I'm just catching up on the chat.
So Matt, there is a function where you can upload documents, at least in student access. So they must have made that change, within the last year, so that you can have a certain amount of attached documents, but they have to be, static. They're not dynamic, I guess.
Victoria, you need Blumen?
I'm sorry, can you say it one more? The audio just cut out just a little bit. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, the question is for Victoria. Can you do this in Blumen, like upload other files? I find Blumen such an unfriendly platform.
I don't have Blumen, so I can't quite speak to that one. Does anyone use Blumen? Oh, okay, okay. So it looks like in the chat, we use Bloomin, but we have to upload our student docs.
Yeah, so this is one of the, like, it sounds like beyond just your institution, right? If you have student access, it sounds like there is a world in which if the application is done through there, if you have your recording services there, if you can put in transcript information or financial aid, you know, certification, like all the stuff we need to fully document, it could be in that space where we don't actually need a physical folder for these students. Now, I've heard some people speak to like, what if I get audited? Aren't they going to make me print all this stuff out anyway? Does anybody have like either experience or kind of some insight in terms of what exactly that process would look like for those who are maybe hesitant to go fully electronic?
I haven't had, hi everyone, Dina Ibarra, Washington State, Trio Talent Search. I have not had to print them when I do a peer review or things like that. However, our university has gone paperless. And so we're moving into the digital stuff. However, in my grant proposal, I said I was going to have both. So I'm stuck with both.
We do kind of a hybrid system. So our application is in student access, and we also print that and keep it in a hard copy in case there needs to be any, amendment to it, like their income that they have to initial and correct. We haven't made them sign because they can use a scribble feature with their mouse and it's time-stamped. So hopefully that's okay. But we also have our intake forms in our OneNote, and I print out their initial screening that I have to have a wet signature on that they're accepted into the program, and that goes in their hard copy file. And then we put all our contact notes in student access, but we also have a log sheet in their hard copy file that just says the date, initials of the advisor, and what services they received during that visit and in what format. Was it online, in person, phone, email? And so that's kind of our backup plan, because a lot of people have to, they make their participants sign that they received this service every time. We found that pretty cumbersome, and so we just have a backup system with 2 places to document our services.
Michelle, yeah, what was we had a request to repeat kind of how you use OneNote.
Oh,
within
OneNote, okay. Our admin assistant has some master files in there of our intake forms. Like there's a selection criteria worksheet that I fill out. I document their eligibility and their academic need and sign it. And that one I print out and sign and keep in their file. And their forms are for a student success plan template, and our advisors will go in there and electronically fill that out. It doesn't get printed. We also have an intake check sheet that goes from the time their application is received all the way through their intake and their first scheduled tutoring appointments or whatever. And each of us have our own parts. So the first part, the admin assistant does, and then the second part is the director on my checklist to make sure I don't forget anything. And then there's a couple more things when someone's accepted that the admin assistant does, and then it goes on to the advisor. And so she can look at that form and update all of the different parts of student access that need to be updated for that student. Who's their assigned advisor? What's the first service date? Blah, blah, blah. Is that helpful?
So I just dropped something in the chat. It was something that was shared with me by Amy Verlanik, and it talks about the regulatory record keeping requirements. And I found this super helpful, primarily because it shows like the 5 things that every TRIO program, regardless of what kind of program, needs to have in a file for a student. And the 5 things are basis for determining eligibility, the student's need for the project, the services provided to participants, educational benefits, progress or performance that the student makes, and then services from any other TRIO or federal programs that the student received. And so if you want, you can download that. That's totally fine with me. It gives you the regulations, where to find all the information. And just having those 5 things is helping us to keep in mind what we put in the student file when we transition from paper to digital, because as you might imagine, our old files, we had like some that were a couple inches thick, right? Because we had transcripts, we had, we had all the different contact sheets for every time they met with their advisor, every time they checked into the office to get food, whatever it may be. And so it's really nice to be able to like synthesize down only the things we must have in that student file.
I have a comment about sort of letting your files get really thick, and I've been told, if you're going to be audited, if it's in a file, they can audit it. So you don't want all of that information in their file. So you really only want sort of the absolutely necessary items there. And when I had a site visit, not audit, but just a, paid for site visit, they were suggested that advisors keep their own files or records, but that your official file only has those certain pieces in it and more sort of APR focused. When we did get audited for my internal sort of audit for my university's business office, picked our program to get audited. I gave them a list of our students that were reported on our APR. They did a random selection of names or number, ID numbers, sent that back to me and picked like 20 files. And then they asked for certain items for those specific students. So then I provided that information for those students. So you don't have to print everything, but we could upload it electronically and send it to them for auditing instead of paper. And actually that's easier. It's easier to, if you do have paper files, they probably would ask you to scan it and send it, upload it to their secure auditing software or, audit box. So.
Yeah, again, I would reiterate, like, keep them as lean as possible. Like, you don't want every activity they've ever done, every notes in there, because the more information you have, like, it's your responsibility to keep that information secure and private, and you don't want information out there that does not need to be. It's there for APR reporting purposes. So like even in your database notes, I know some people use Lumen Student Access to varying degrees and extents to how much you put those notes in there, but it's meant to document services, not to document that like moms, I've been having a real tough time with mom lately. So like, I agree, like have your advisors have a different process for just keeping individualized notes that is separate from like official files.
I have a question for folks at the college level, for student information systems that have come out now, all the technology that we use to do advising. So we have Navigate. I don't know if other institutions are using Navigate, but it's basically a platform just like Student Access or Blumen, where you record your contacts and your interactions with students. And I'm wondering, how does that play into the work that you do to keep student files? Because I will tell you, like, I find it unnerving that I have to duplicate everything. Like, I have to put a contact in Navigate and I got to put something in Student Access, and like the duplication of record keeping and what we put where and how much information we share with our community because everybody, faculty or staff, can see the notes that we put in there. And so a lot of that stuff's pretty private. And I'm just wondering if anybody else kind of struggles internally with that, or has a process that's worked well for them in navigating the duplication with services. Okay. So I see what Southern Oregon University, when we put academic specific things, we think that the major advisor would need to know. Okay. I'm also curious to know, like, is there an inherent benefit to keeping all the information in your student access, right? Because that's internal. So having all the regulatory record keeping things in there versus having them in something like, like our Google shared drive, right? Like, I guess we've been doing so much through our Google shared drive that it just makes sense to have it there for us, but it would, I'm trying to understand, like, what are the costs and benefit, I guess, of including that information in one place versus the other.
I presume it's just convenience. Most people don't love navigating. Like, you have ultimate control over what you build in your Google Drive or a Microsoft team. So you can create as many subfolders you can. It's easy to just drag and drop a folder to, whereas, there were people in Blooming that are like, we kind of discovered in the chat, there's some suggestions about how you can upload PDFs, but that's not even a thing that's quite known. And some folks, Tamika had said, like, they get nervous about putting everything in there, because what if we just had to switch? Like, do we just lose all of that? I've heard some nightmares of folks this year with APRs, or they switched, database providers and had to like manually enter 1,000 students to get their APR done this year. And like, that's horrifying if you decide to use, because it sounds like they do have the capacity to put everything in there. And it'd be a one-stop shop. It's a little extra busy work, but we already do that for paper files, right? Like, regardless of what it is, we're kind of using these different technologies and trying to figure out what's the best place to funnel it all to. So obviously, if it's in Teams, if it's in a drive, fully under your control. But then you also have to, it gets dangerous because you have to limit access. That's the piece too, because if you're putting it all in a Google Drive, you have to, who has access to the folder? Can they manipulate documents? If it's a lot of PDFs, like if you pay for the paid version of Adobe, you can edit PDFs, like you can just change them unless they're specific PDFs that are like non-changeable or certified with that signature, like I was talking about. So DocuSign is helpful in that way because it's that certified signature as a PDF, but it gets more cumbersome to limit who has access and are these things capable of being altered. Whereas in student access, I mean, in theory, that is, it's with most things, I think in Trail World as a director, it's what level of risk and work, like, yeah, where do you land in terms of how you want to do this? But with all these things, like we have to store all this stuff somewhere, right? Exactly what Victoria shared. Like there's certain things you have to store. So it's just a matter of how you want to go about doing that and what is the most efficient way to do it. And we're trying to just reduce inefficiencies and duplication of work. I've seen some admins who spend like weeks of their life in the summer just printing things and getting paper cuts on every single finger, like filing, trying to pull pages out, right? And like manually check things. So I don't think that's better, but yeah, you kind of have to piece together all of these, like we're throwing out tons of software out here. You just have to piece together, like, what do I have access to? What do we use? And what's the most streamlined for us? I have when it comes to record retention, does that become an issue? Because as long as you're reporting APRs, you obviously still have them in your database system, but like, can you all go, because we have to keep them 3 years beyond when we report on those students. Like, is that also going to be accessible through those database systems, should you choose to use that?
I'm not sure what you're asking, Matt. Can you just
Yeah.
rephrase that?
Yeah, let me. I'm gonna find the exact regulations on. It's basically how long do we have to retain, like, your records. Okay. Bear with me. We're going to do a live CFR search. Okay, so retention requirements for your records. Everything reporting on the APR, like you obviously have to hold it. So how long do you have to hold it? It's not the same for everyone. I saw somewhere in the chat, someone said 10 years. It's different for every, well, in theory, it's not different, but it's the number of years you're literally holding files is different for an SSS, it's different for McNair, it's different for an upper bound because you track your students differently. So financial records, supporting documents, statistical records, and all other non-federal entity records pertinent to a federal award must be retained for a period of 3 years from the date of submission of the final expenditure report, or APR. So it's 3 years from the final time you report on the students in that cohort. So for, that's why it literally just depends on your program, right? Because we all have different reporting requirements based on how long we're following each cohort. So the question is, if we're holding these, it's easy to have, like, you box them all up, right? I've seen these in paper formats. You go, look, this is this cohort, it sits in a box, it goes in the back closet, and you just sit it there and you can put a countdown date that starting on this date on this year, we can purge all of these documents. But if they're electronic, you know, it's similarly easy to kind of make a subfolder of when you can purge it. But if it is in student access, if it is in Bloomin, if you are relying on all the information being in there, the question was, do we all still have, like, do you guys have access to go that far back in your cohorts?
In the database?
Yes.
Yes, ours don't disappear.
Okay.
We just code them differently depending on their status. But you also, you know, if your institution like ours requires a longer period, so we have to follow the institution's 5 years for our SSS.
Yes. Thank you for that. Are there any other maybe topics, questions, thoughts, or elements that you all kind of do in this realm of work that is worth maybe touching on here? That's good. Is anybody fully digital? Like, you literally have no paper copies at this stage? So I presume, is everybody, that just means everyone's doing twice as much work, right? That's what I'm reading. If you're going to have a paper file, you need to have all of it. So,
Well, we do some things just electronically and some things are included in the paper file. We try to only retain what's required in the paper file, plus current transcripts, things that we're going to access when the student's in front of us and maybe write on. But our students can log in on an iPad when they come in and use our study area, and that's connected directly to student access. Our tutors and mentors put in their contacts in student access. We do use Microsoft Forms for our surveys, for workshop participation and feedback on those. So it's really a combo. We do as much electronic as we can though.
yeah, Kenchi, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to say that like with income information that we get, I think it's important that we have it actually a paper copy, because that is a snapshot of the student at that moment that we do the intake on whether they're low income or not. And, you know, if we try to upload that data later, their income may have changed. So you know, it's good to have that paper copy to show that, okay, at the time we did the intake, this is what it was.
That's a good point, Kenji. I would say, like, right now, similar to Tamika, we're in the process of going fully digital. I think that we're probably going to stick with putting things in the Google Drive just because it is a private and secure mechanism that the university, you know, pays for. And it's, you know, guarded with the multiple authentication, you know, like we have to sign in like twice. So I think we'll probably keep that just in case something happens with student access. I mean, I still love student access for the APR side of things, right? Like I love putting that information in there and it does everything it needs to do for me. I think it's important to have contacts in there, obviously, because that's a consistent place to put that information. But right now we're in the midst of transitioning all of our paper files. And that I think is the hardest thing for us right now is like making time, and summer is going to be the best time to do this, making time and setting a process and like procedure for what information stays, what information goes. Is it scanned correctly? You know, was it a two-sided document and you only got the one side of it? You know, like there are some like logistical things to this that we just need to like iron out a process for. And then once that's done, I think we'll like be able to get a flow going. But yeah, I think that is the thing that I'm struggling with the most, like just diving in and starting and like having a consistent process, or, you know, trusting like the student worker is going to do this correctly if I, you know, really clearly have my expectations lined out, and having a quality control, you know, somebody to check to make sure it's all there, because it's not something I want to like find out 50 documents in or 50 students in that we were doing wrong the whole time.
Melissa.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And also just the conversation about all of this, that there is no right one way to do this. And we're all at kind of different stages. But what I was thinking is from here moving forward, putting together the policy and procedure in my office for from here on out, and not necessarily worrying about going backwards and trying to digitize all the old stuff. Because if anything, number one, I need to look at what we're purging, you know, those old files, but also why create a lot more work for ourselves, instead maybe focus on the moving forward part. So, and because I think it's going to keep changing each year, we're going to maybe be able to add more, you know, or digitize more, or find easier processes, you know, as we do this more. So going backwards is a lot of work that maybe we don't need. For me.
It's so funny that you mentioned that like never occurred to me. Like literally never occurred to me that I could not do it. Because I thought it had to be all one way or all the other way, I guess. And like, there's no rule that says that, but that's just my like absolutist thinking. Like, I want to do it right. I want everything to be consistent, you know. And this is like one of those things where it would be nice if we had it all in one place. But the other thing is like there's space, you know, like right now we don't have a lot of space, but like, what are we going to do with all those cabinets, all those, you know, file cabinets that we got? Like they got to hold something.
There you go. Look, Melissa, you just saved Victoria weeks of her summer potentially, right? You just fix it moving forward, and we just slowly, those files get thinner and thinner as the years progress potentially. I do think, as much as we love our database systems, like I've seen some, I know, right? Like they do a good job with APR, but I don't know that they're meant for APR. They're not meant for this stuff. Now, in theory, they can check a lot of these boxes, but I think maybe the best practices moving forward is like, what internal systems, whether it's drives, whether it's Teams, SharePoint, whatever it is, what systems do you have so you can substantially limit who has access to files, and then how do we put things on there? And it is a little extra work. That comment had gotten brought up before, like we'll have to export certain reports out of your database system. You'll have to, take applications, you'll have to take those intake forms, like whatever it is that you're showing academic need, like, yeah, all that stuff will need to get moved into those files, but that's not necessarily different work than printing it and moving it into a physical file either. So I don't know. It's more of a policy and procedure process to what you're speaking to. But then you just kind of make sure it is bare minimum. And then it's similarly, what are the checks and balances, right? What are we doing on a yearly basis to go through those files and make sure that the stuff's in there is only stuff that really should be in there. So I think maybe, I don't think there's ever going to be one magical way to do this, because you might work at an institution too that doesn't have a drive or Teams. They want everything on just like generic G drive, whatever. And that tends to be where you put like all of your documents, every single form and flyer and workshop. And like, is that really the best place for those? Like, I don't know. It kind of needs to be individualized. Similarly, like policy and procedure manuals, like that kind of needs to be something that is digitized, but also one of the things in those legislation we read is that it needs to be unalterable. So even with your policy and procedure manual, like does the current one you have, hopefully you have one, like is it unalterable, or does everyone have access to it as a Word document and someone could go in there and just like delete everything? And like, yeah, maybe you got like a paper copy saved somewhere, but if it's just in some shared drive and everyone has access to it, that means anybody can mess with it. So is it a read-only document that only you have access to as a director, or you give access to it as an admin? So that needs to be something that is, it's not just about putting it all in a place that's accessible. You have to understand who has access to it, because that is ultimately the kind of more important thing. That's why people get so obsessive about all their locked doors and locked file cabinets and where you keep that key. Like those are very specific policies you need to have in place to ensure the safety of those records. So that needs to be an element you keep in mind. So are there any other thoughts or questions as it relates to just digitizing these pieces? One question here for pre-college, how long does everyone keep their basically forms for their trips, like field trip forms and whatnot? I wish I could. I worked in pre-college and I didn't. This was not in my genre. I have no idea how it was. They were not in the students' files, so they obviously just keep them chunked together. And I don't know if they just keep them for the academic year or if they held them longer. But does anyone else have anything to weigh in on field trip forms and how long they keep those? Okay.
This is Dina. I actually don't know if we even keep them after the field trip is over. We just make a contact, but that's about it. Like we were saying, the more you keep, the more you have to submit in case of an audit. So for us, because we have so many students, that means we have, again, we're keeping physical files, which means that's a lot of space. We have over 700 students in our program. So we really just do our application, parent application, student parent application, and then we just do transcripts to keep academic progress. Outside of that, we used to have, and the thing there wasn't consistency when I started, that every student didn't have the same information. So we decided not to keep any forms or other documentation that really was not pertaining to that year, and or things that go back to the APR. And so since we don't have to report how many field trips they went to and how many of that, it's already on their contacts, then we just keep certain academic progress, enrollment, FAFSA, and that's about it.
All right. Well, to wrap up this specific conversation, the first person that fully figures out how to do this dang thing, like go present at the COE annual conference and show the country how it's done, because I think we're all still figuring it out. So, but thank you all for contributing, and those of you in the chat. Like, this is helpful just to kind of, this is one of very much those shared spaces of just like a sharing session, right? Where like I don't think is one right way to do it. Just what is it we are all doing, and how can you kind of just improve your own processes? So, and Victoria, though, you wanted to ask some APR questions, right?
Oh yeah, I guess so. I'm curious to know with APR, you know, the pandemic has really done a number on our students and staff and pretty much everybody. I'm curious to know if people have seen significant, I guess, like themes come out. Like, are you seeing that your students are kind of holding steady with where they've been? Are you seeing, like, for instance, for us, like, we're still meeting our objectives, but we've seen like a 20 percentage point drop in good academic standing. So like, that is significant to me. And like, I feel like that's, it's not quite the same like lagging indicator that graduation, like retention and graduation can be. It seems like more of a, not quite leading, but like, it's a real important one. Like, if our students are not meeting good academic standing, which our institution defines as a GPA above a 2.0, how are they going to persist? How are they going to graduate? So I'm just curious if any themes have come out in your guys' APR data related to student success.
I would say we're not exceeding our objectives as much as we normally do in those areas, and we're not meeting transfer at all. But I'm also going to look at the way that was pulled when I wrote the last proposal, because it shot way up for the institution, and so we had to raise our objectives, and I'm not convinced that it was accurate. So, but that's the one we're not making right now.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point with the 2-year SSS programs. We're yeah. See how that would.
I'm SSS, and we did not meet our good academic standing numbers this year for the first time in 10 years that I've been here, and we probably dropped by like 5%.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that good academic standing, it's a doozy. Like, you're like, oh, it's not too bad because we still met our objective. But if you see like double digits, like in a drop, you know that that's going to impact the next year and the year after that, right? Like, it's kind of a canary in the coal mine. How about my McNair friends out there in McNair land? Any?
I know for our program, we pretty much hit all of our numbers. I think we were just one student short, but the maximum we can serve is only 28. So I think we had like 27, but that's kind of different from SS since we have different things to base that on. So, but we're doing pretty good. It was close, but we're still on top of it.
Okay.
Okay. Our institution at UF, we're very, very close to becoming Hispanic Serving Institute. So that hopefully will help in another 5 years. I mean, I know because we are in DeSantis land. So I don't know. You know, we're kind of like concerned what's going to happen with what is going on in Florida, and if it can affect a federal grant. Yeah.
Ooh, that is a significant concern to have.
Very unfortunate.
Yeah. It is interesting to see right now institutions that are kind of either moving into or out of being a minority serving institution. UAF is getting very close to being like a minority serving institution for Alaska Native and American like Indigenous students. We're like we're getting ever closer to that, which would change, I think, a lot of things about how the university considers practices with, retention and student success. But I appreciate you guys sharing kind of some insights about APR, primarily because next week we head to Washington, D.C. for a board meeting, myself and Dina and Jeff. And so it's great for us to know kind of on a practical level how our programs are doing, because that information greatly impacts the types of conversations we have with our national leadership. And so just really grateful for the comments and the feedback. Helps us get a better sense, not just for what's happening in our specific program and institution, but kind of at a larger scale.
I do know the talent search programs have got their butt kicked, especially the NAEOP, Oregon, Washington. Cost of living is so high. People make more money, even though they're still low income, and it's just hard to get enough dubs. I have so many, there are programs that are like under their 50%. They're funded to a certain number. Also in part because we can't retain staff, right? Because the HR department, right? Like it's that challenge of like, we don't have enough to pay people to keep staff. And if you don't have advisors in schools, there's just nobody there. There's no recruiting happening. Like it is just a nightmare. So I know the talent search and even some upper bounds who have, a tenth of the caseload are really, really struggling just to recruit. So Jacob.
Yeah, it popped in my head. So we have Bloomin', but we haven't started using it yet. When we bought our license, it was right when my director was switching into her position. And then when they pushed back APR, Bloomin' said they were canceling all training until after APR was over. So next month on the 21st and 22nd, we're actually having a Bloomin' trainer come to our office and spend 2 days with us training us on Bloomin'. So I was going to offer to, I'll put my email address in the chat. And if anybody's got any specific questions that they just had burning or whatever, I can try to remember to ask when we got. And then I know Naomi works pretty closely with Matt. Maybe we can write up something once I've got a Bloomin' person to pick their brain and report back to you guys and see if we can't find any tips and tricks to help life with Bloomin' be a little bit better. So yeah, but I think our plan though is pretty much just to be using Bloomin' for APR purposes only and keep our own files. We have Box here at SOU, so it's pretty easy to limit who's got access to it. Naomi controls all of it. And we'll just use Bloomin' for APR, especially if we ever decide to switch to a different database later on or whatever. So there's my email address. If anybody wants to reach out to me and has any questions, I'll write them down and pick that guy's brain.
Well, that's perfect. Yeah, and as you're starting to think about your state conferences or regional conferences, inviting those people to come in and do a presentation specifically about like how best to utilize the software that they provide for something like this. Matt, for the last couple of years, has been leading our conference planning committee, and I think getting those people in and they have a table right at your regional conference, but then also making them present about something that is tangible, something is useful to the people that you have in your membership for your regional association. And so I think having specific topics for them to present on is nice, because then the labor is not on the shoulders of the professional doing the job. It's on the shoulders of the person who's providing the service to the program.
I want to quickly, there's a question about like recordings. So I record all these. This is the NAEOP website, naeoptrio.org. Under there, we have events. You can come to our conference. It's going to be in Boise in October. Not we, but we, yada, yada. But under events, professional development series, I basically just make a page that has every single session we do month over month. So if you want to hear somebody have just like a cool Lex and Bregs conversation and hear the conversation around that, I kind of just put these on YouTube and just post them on the website. So probably early next week, there'll be another page on here that will be this conversation. So if you want to share with staff, or if you ever want to re-reference this, right? If you were like, oh, there was like some tidbit I forgot about, we kind of storm there, so you don't have to like remember some Zoom like link in your email somewhere. So
Yeah, thanks for hosting that on the website, Matt. That's super helpful. Yeah, I think that something that was brought up a little bit earlier too was the vacancies, like the staff vacancies. I know in Idaho, there's just been some like repeated vacancies that are going unfilled, multiple failed searches, you know, people deciding to leave, you know, just not wanting to work in rural areas. Also, I feel like that there's some components to that become really difficult, like attracting people to institutions that are in rural locations. So yeah, I feel like those are conversations I look forward to having on a national level, because I feel like there's a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities, and would love to hear people's creative solutions to kind of filling those types of vacancies.
all right, well, I think we're pretty much wrapped up here. If anybody wants to stick around or has any other questions, I won't shut it down immediately, but thank you so much for joining us. Next month, oh man, just went, what are we doing next month? No, I'm a little more prepared than this. Give me 5 seconds and I'll tell you.
Is our podcast up
It
yet?
says APR tracking on my printout.
Thank you. We kind of dropped the ball on that early in Jan. Well, the APR got all thrown wacky, whatever. So what we're trying to do, we're bringing in people that have gotten really, really, really good at using their databases, whether it is Bloom and Student Access. So that way, how you're using that throughout the entire academic year is in such a way that when it comes to APR, you just hit like the APR button and almost everything is in there, right? It's like, how do you use these systems you pay a ton of money for to their maximums to make your APR as simple as possible? So we want to do this kind of this time of year, because like you have plenty of time to kind of hear some feedback, see some best practices, and then implement that and how you're kind of going into summer, things you maybe want to change so that kind of moving forward, you know, APR just goes smoother and all that information is in there. And you aren't one of these programs that has to manually enter 1,000 students. That is our goal there, is to have a couple people present some of their best practices so you can get the most out of those database systems. So, and we debated having like people from Bloom and Student Access come and do it. But again, those tend to turn into kind of sales pitches. So unless you're doing specifically what like Jacob and the Southern program are doing, like that gets more targeted. But we kind of really wanted to focus on just our trio peers who speak more our language and what it is we are looking for and how we can use it, and less about just like, oh, you can send mass texts and whatnot. Like, hey, that's great. That doesn't help me with APR, buddy. So yes, thank you, Michelle. And we do have, I keep needing to promote it, but the first episode is just me, and that feels so arrogant to just like, everyone go listen to the podcast. But we started a podcast out of the NAEOP region. The idea is really just to highlight right now what we're doing with it is just kind of highlighting some of our regional leaders. So it's called What's Your Why? A podcast for trio professionals. It should be on all your podcast players, but we're going to start releasing an episode every month. We have about 5 recorded. So last month we released 1. We should have 1 coming out here in the next week or so. But yes, we want to start just sharing so you can kind of meet some of the leadership who works in your region that are trio professionals. And then ideally in the future, maybe we can interview some students or have conversations with legislators, but just have kind of get into that space. I'm sure you need another podcast to listen to, but if you want to go and subscribe and hear me talk for half an hour, you could do it in 15 minutes if you do it ×2 speed. But yeah, you feel free to do that. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us here. So have a good
Thanks,
rest of your
Matt.
day.
Thanks, Matt.
See you guys later.